you may notice a few differences with the way things look here. I was noticing the darkness of 3D view here was causing a little bit of stress on my eyes. Not much, but enough that I realized if I just lightened it up a little bit, it was more relaxing. And then also this cube here, you'll see is now highlighted in white instead of yellow or orange and so on. If I duplicate this cube a few times by hitting D, and I'll just duplicate it. So by default in Blender, if I hold Shift and select multiple objects, there would normally be the overall selection, and then there would be another color denoting the active object, or that is the last object you have selected. So for instance, over here in the outliner, we see that there's these white kind of translucent spheres over each of these objects, and this indicates that these are all selected. However, the cube 0.002 that we just made or whatever is highlighted in orange, denoting that that's the active object. And while there are some good reasons for why you would want to have your active object highlighted in a separate color from your overall selection, to me, mostly I find that to be not very intuitive at all, because when I'm sitting here and making a selection, I know which object is the last object I've selected, or I don't really care because whatever I'm doing involves all the things I just selected. So to me, it's kind of a redundancy, and it makes the layout of Blender more confusing. So that, in addition to like the wireframe color and the grid and a few other things, I have been working on. So if you would like to get a hold of those, just go to blendersensei.com, and under the announcements you'll see all the documentation for that, and you can download the theme. And to install it, you just click here, go to User Preferences, and then under Themes, down here you'll see Install Theme. Click that. Then navigate to the folder on your computer, your hard drive, desktop, wherever you downloaded it. Click it, click Install Theme. If you want to keep them, just click Save User Settings, and the next time you start up Blender it will be there. If not, just don't save them, and when you restart it, all will be well. Okay, so I've started out with a fresh scene here. So first, if I hit Shift A and add a plane and then hit S to scale it, you'll see that down here in the camera view, things appear a lot brighter than in the 3D view. And that is because by default in the 3D view we are in solid shading mode. To see the effects of any lamps or shadows or anything like that in the 3D viewport, we need to select texture mode here. Now we're able to see the effects of them. First thing I'm going to do is select this plane, and I'm going to click the material tab, and I'm just going to give it a new material. And then under diffuse, that's basically your object's raw color. I'm just going to make that a bit grayer so we have some differentiation from the cube here in the center. So now I'm going to hit A to select everything and G to grab and just pull everything up some so I'm not touching the grid, as you can see here. If I just select the cube, hit G to grab, and then pull it up, then we'll immediately see the shadow produced in the scene here. So if I hit W to add smoothing in a subdivision surface, and then I click on my little wrench to get back to my modifiers, and I bump the view up to 3 and the render up to 5 or so, and I hit S to scale, you'll see this super pixelated shadow here. And if I zoom in on it and I hit space to do a little test render, you'll see that immediately that pixelated shadow goes into a really nice smooth shadow. And I'll hit space to get out of that. But that is because I actually have two different lamps set up in Sensei format by default. You can't see them in the scene because I, by default, keep the visibility off. But if you click the little eye, you'll see the lamp there, as well as the camera too, if you wanted to see that directly in the scene. But I normally keep the visibility of those off because it just adds clutter to my workspace until I need to alter them. If I click this little plus sign, which now displays all the items parented to this object, this scene light, which is a little invention of mine, is actually composed of two different lights. The purpose of this light is that if I click on the scene shadows, we'll see that the type of light this is a spotlight. And under shadow, we'll see that this is set to buffer shadow. Now, unfortunately, to my knowledge, yeah, you can't shift select both of these to be on at the same time. It would be nice if you could, because then I wouldn't need two different type of lamps. Unfortunately, the buffer shadow is the only shadow type in Blender that will display in your 3D view. So what I have set up here is two different spotlights, one called the scene shadows, which under shadows uses the buffer shadow type, and then the render shadows, as you'll see immediately, uses the ray type. A ray type does not display in the 3D view. So for instance, if you want to turn off the effect of a light in your scene, you actually have to click the render icon, and that will then turn off the effect. So as you can see, we still have the effect on here on the render shadows, but we don't see any shadow even though we have it selected. That's because the ray shadows only render when you either render your scene or select the viewport mode of render to do a test, which is very slow because it's basically doing an entire render in the 3D viewport. So if I hit space down here, we'll see the evidence of that ray shadow rendered shadow there, but we're not able to see it in the 3D view when we're working around. So one thing I discovered is that, number one, it's super fun to have shadows on and be able to work in that way. Number two, it turns out to be very helpful when you're designing, especially architecture and a bunch of different things. So for instance, if I turn my scene shadows on, which uses the buffer shadow, and I hit 5 to go into top view, you'll see that we have this outline of this shadow around the sphere, which otherwise, if I turn that off by clicking the render icon, we wouldn't have. Now this shape is pretty well defined against the background of this plane here, but what if I hit D to duplicate this plane, and I hit S to scale it, and hit 5 to go into top view, and I click off here, you can't see it at all. But when we're working with a default shadow system, we have a lot more reference as we're designing, as we're creating. Frankly, it's just a lot funner to have all these cool shadows around when you're doing stuff. Occasionally, the pixelation will make it a bit harder to work in your scene, or you may see some strange, like fractally looking noise like around an object or whatever. So if it is getting in the way of whatever you're doing while you're in texture mode, you won't see it at all while you're in solid mode, then of course you can just turn it off. The render shadows, which uses the ray shadow setup, is set up to very good default levels that neither take up too much resources but still produce a very high quality result. If I click the render button here to render this little scene, we'll see that that renders in 0.95 seconds. However, if I turn the render shadows back on and hit render, inevitably it'll be much more than 1 second. Well, it took about 2.98 seconds. So we do get these really nice looking shadows with this, but if you're in testing mode and you're doing things like that and you want to speed up your render, you can turn that off.